Hello, listeners! Welcome to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's golden age and the few years surrounding it. I am your host, Erin Carlson. Today, we will be discussing the Queen of all Pinups, Bettie Page. I want to preface Bettie's story by saying I spend way more time researching some individuals more than others, and Bettie Page fell right into that category. She lived a complex and complicated life, and I found it important to share what she went through, because there is way more to the life of Bettie Page than her sexy pinup photos. Bettie Mae Page was born in Nashville, Tennessee on April 22, 1923. She was the second of 6 children for parents Walter and Edna. Walter was an auto mechanic and Edna was a homemaker and a mother, the most popular career for women in the 1920s. 4 more babies followed pretty quickly for the young couple, and Bettie was put to work at a very young age helping to care for her younger siblings. She missed out on a lot of typical childhood experiences because so much was expected of her at home. When Bettie was 5 years old, though, she was in the church Christmas pageant, and for the first time, she felt attention. The entire congregation was paying attention to her, and they applauded her. She loved it, and she wanted more. She would always crave that attention that she never received. I would love to tell you that the lack of adequate attention was the worst problem in little Bettie's childhood. Unfortunately, I can't. Roy was not a kind husband, and he and Edna fought a lot. Then came the Great Depression to make matters much worse. The family was forced to travel all around Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, wherever Roy could find work as a mechanic. Of course, the Great Depression made it difficult for people to own cars, so there wasn't the need for as many auto mechanics anymore. It was a really difficult time for the family. In 1930, when Bettie was 7 years old, the family was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Roy wasn't making enough money to pay rent, and the family was evicted from their apartment. Roy, Edna, and their 6 children were homeless, and they knew virtually no one in Tulsa. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Roy stole a car so he could get his impoverished family back to Tennessee so they could stay with his mother. The family did not make it to Nashville, though. Well, not all of them. The owner of the car tracked them down. Unfortunately for Roy, the owner of the car he stole was a deputy sheriff. Roy was arrested and spent the next 2 years in prison. Luckily, Edna and the kids still made their way to Roy's mother's house in Nashville. They had a roof over their heads, but couldn't afford much else. No clothes, little food, and definitely no toys. The children would be forced to walk barefoot to school. After Roy's stint in prison, he rejoined the family. In a comparison that shows the contrast between today and the 1930s, the family was somehow able to purchase a 40-acre farm with very little money. For 2 short years, even though the family was in deep poverty, Bettie experienced a happy childhood and made wonderful childhood memories on the farm. Since the family couldn't afford toys or entertainment, the children had to use their imaginations and be creative with their times of play. Bettie later remembered a lot of happiness on the farm. Of course, living on a farm is hard work, too. All of the Page children were responsible for daily chores on the farm. Roy promised all of them an allowance for their hard work, but none of them ever received a cent from him. He just wasn't the greatest guy. Want some more proof? In 1933, when Roy was 37 years old, he was caught having sex with a 15-year-old neighbor girl. And then the girl got pregnant. Her father chased Roy down with a shotgun, rightfully so, and Edna chased him down with the kitchen dishes, also rightfully so. She didn't care that she couldn't afford to buy new plates and bowls. She broke every single dish in the farmhouse, with Roy being the intended target of each and every one of them. She was pissed. And she was done with Roy. I'm not sure who cared for the children initially after this final ordeal, but Edna hitchhiked her way back into Nashville alone to try and rebuild a new life for her and her 6 children. She secured work as a hairstylist and launderer, working day and night, and was finally able to send for her children once she was settled in. She was luckily able to afford a tiny house, but it was very tight quarters for the family of 7. Edna was at her breaking point. I mean, just imagine the burden she now carried. She alone was responsible for supporting herself and 6 children during the Great Depression. She was stressed, she was angry, and she took her anger out on her children, especially the girls. Edna made the difficult decision to surrender her 3 daughters to a church orphanage. She kept the boys with her since they were more useful for working. Betty was 10 years old, her sisters younger. They would spend 2 years as orphans under the care of strict church mothers. Betty coped with her tumultuous childhood before, during, and after her time at the orphanage by performing. She would go into various characters and perform her little heart out for whoever would watch her. She would dance, she would act, she would impersonate, she would sing. This was usually as much an emotional escape for her audiences as it was for her. In 1935, when Betty was 12 years old, her mother felt she was able to care for her daughters again. But life wasn't much better at home than it had been when they left 2 years earlier. Betty always felt the scars of abandonment from her mother's decision to put her and her sisters in an orphanage. But it was the Great Depression, and Edna was a single mother of 6 children. I think she did the best she could, but she was put in an impossible situation, as were many other mothers during the Depression. Luckily, as Betty grew into adolescence, she was able to more clearly see how hard her mother had worked for her and her siblings, and how strong of a woman she really was. Adolescence also brought Betty near constant daydreams of being a Hollywood star. The lifestyles of stars couldn't be more different than that of her own life, but the escape brought peace and hope for a better life. She dreamed so much for a better life. But that better life wasn't coming for a while. In fact, when she thought it couldn't get much worse, it did just that. Betty's father, Roy, found himself homeless and out of work again when Betty was 13 years old, and Edna rented him a room in the basement for a small fee. That woman was a saint, especially considering what comes next. Roy immediately began sexually assaulting 13-year-old Betty, his own daughter. And he would pay her off with dimes that she could use to go see movies in exchange for her silence, because he knew that she loved escaping her life through movies. And he was giving her yet one more thing that she needed an emotional escape from. This man was disgusting. Would you believe me if I said it gets even worse for young Bettie Page? Well, it does. Roy luckily moved out of Edna's basement and got his own place. Edna was dating a man quite a bit younger than her, and he began making sexual advances at Betty. When Edna found out about it, she blamed her daughter. She accused Betty of initiating the incidents. She physically attacked her daughter and kicked her out of the house. Betty had nowhere to go except to her father's house. She was forced to live with her abuser for months until her mother allowed her to come home. The sexual abuse Betty experienced from her father changed her. The once outgoing child who was entertaining those around her was now a quiet girl who kept to herself. She hid behind books and in front of movie screens. She devoted herself to academics and daydreaming about living a life like the movie stars that she admired so much. Her father had broken her. She retreated into her own little world. Her survival was up to her and her alone. Aside from her devotion to her studies in high school, she joined any extracurricular program that she could. She was the editor of the school paper and the yearbook. She was on the debate team. She was chairman of the college club. She was in ROTC. She was in the drama club. And she acted in school plays. She loved the plays. She wanted to do all she could to be good enough to be awarded an academic scholarship, a scholarship that could lead her out of her poverty-ridden, abusive life. Not only was Betty extremely intellectual and driven in high school, she was drop-dead gorgeous. The combination of these things made her the most popular girl in school. All the girls were jealous of her, and all the boys wanted to date her. But Edna forbade Betty from dating. She wasn't allowed to have a social life at all, really, especially with boys. Betty seemed okay with that for the most part. Her sights were set on academics and preparing her mind to be her key out of Nashville. That is, until she met Billy Neal. Betty was 17 years old and a senior in high school the day she met Billy Neal. Billy was 19 years old and a junior in high school when they met. Yes, you heard that right. Betty brushed off Billy when he first approached her on the street with a cheesy pickup line. But he was one determined kid. Billy went to a different high school and he started skipping out of school early so he could be at Betty's school when she walked out. Now, I think this is kind of stalkerish behavior, but Betty found it charming. Nobody had ever given her attention like that before, and she craved that attention. The two were quickly sneaking around. They'd go dancing, see movies, and have picnics in the park. He even would buy her dresses, which I think is really romantic. Billy gave Betty happiness and love. She finally had happiness. Until her mother found out about the relationship. Edna once again kicked Betty out of the house, and she was forced to live with her father and his new wife. Betty graduated from high school in June of 1940. She was voted smartest and most likely to succeed by her fellow classmates. She graduated second in her class, coming in just barely under a tie with the valedictorian. She received an academic scholarship to attend the George Peabody College for Teachers. She was the student and young adult most parents dream their children will become. But Bettie Page gave her graduation speech and accepted her scholarship without a proud mother watching from the audience. Edna Page did not attend her oldest daughter's graduation. With college just a few months away, Betty spent as much time as she could with Billy that summer after high school graduation. She was still living with her father, and although he didn't really like Billy, he didn't put up much of a fight. He pretty much just didn't want to parent her. As she did in high school, Betty immersed herself in clubs and organizations in college. She was secretary of the drama club, and she was in the school radio guild. She was performing like crazy. She appeared in 7 plays, acted in weekly radio dramas, and even wrote her very own radio play. And she worked as a secretary all through college. She worked for an English professor named Dr. Alfred Leland Crabb, and he and his wife became surrogate parents to her. She spent most of her weekends with the Crabbs in their big, comfortable home. She'd never had a big, comfortable home before, and she'd also never had indoor plumbing. At the Crabbs, Mrs. Crabb would run hot baths for her every weekend and fill her belly with delicious home-cooked meals. The Crabbs were the family that she always wanted and never had. Back on campus, Betty was getting even more attention from the young men at her college than she did in high school. The Air Force cadets apparently called her Duchess and would raise their swords whenever she walked by. She was the queen of the campus. And this made Billy very jealous. The jealousy worsened when head of her class Betty was chosen for a coveted student teacher position, and all of the young men in her class obviously had the hots for her. Billy repeatedly begged Betty to marry him, but she didn't want to get married so young. She wanted to graduate from college and start her career in teaching, maybe make her way into an acting career someday. Billy did not respect her wishes, though. He was too possessive of her, and he needed to make her his and his alone. In February of 1943, Billy whisked Betty away on a day trip to Gallatin, Tennessee, about 30 miles north of Nashville. But he had a plan up his sleeve. They were going straight to the Sumner County Courthouse, and they were getting married. Before Betty even fully grasped what was happening, she was a married woman. Billy had manipulated Betty into marrying him. And they lived happily ever after. The end. Just kidding, I wish. But sadly, that's not how Bettie Page's story plays out. Of course, Billy's possessiveness immediately became 10 times worse once they were married. He resented her for her intelligence, and he wanted her to drop out of college. She was very close to graduation, mind you, and to give up the whole idea of a teaching career or any other dreams that she had. Billy worked a series of low-paying jobs and had no desire to go to college. He basically wanted to give her a life of poverty. In the spring of 1944, Betty graduated from college with honors and a brand new shiny bachelor's degree in education. But she was disillusioned about a career in teaching after her experience with the young men in her student teaching class. She had another idea, and with Billy recently being drafted into the Army to ride out the remainder of World War II serving his country, Betty was finally left to make her own decisions. Betty felt that her physical appearance was going to negatively affect her career in teaching. So, she thought, how could her physical appearance help her in a positive way? Betty entered a local beauty pageant in Nashville the summer after college graduation, and she came in second place. Billy was stationed out of San Francisco and about to go out to sea. So Betty took the opportunity to pack her bags and leave Nashville behind for the Golden State and sparkling new possibilities. Betty rented a small apartment in San Francisco, and before Billy's ship was even out of sight, she decided she was taking back her maiden name and telling Billy they were getting divorced the minute he returned. Marrying him had been a huge mistake. One day, Betty met a man in advertising named Art Grayson who was visiting the business Betty worked at as a secretary. Art was a former director of silent movies, and he still had many connections in the film industry. And he arranged for her to do some modeling and would also try to use his studio connections to maybe get her a screen test. Well, he did, and Betty received a telegram from 20th Century Fox asking her to travel to LA for a screen test. She was over the moon excited. Unfortunately, the screen test didn't go well. Betty's natural beauty was covered up with mounds of makeup to the point that she was barely recognizable, and her Tennessee accent was not appealing on screen. After the screen test, when she declined a date with one of the studio execs, he told her, "You'll be sorry." There was her answer. This was supposed to be Betty's ticket to the glamorous life she dreamed of all throughout her childhood. Her denial from the studio sent her into a deep depression, and she very quickly gained 40 pounds. One day, she realized what she was doing to herself. She realized that instead of wallowing in self-pity and settling for a life she didn't want, she was going to get off her butt and do something about it. She hit the gym, replaced the junk food that filled her apartment with fruits and vegetables, and she set out into the world with a heightened determination and a drive to succeed. Betty enrolled in a modeling class. She set her sights on modeling because she was extremely self-conscious of her southern accent. She could never make it as an actress with that voice, she thought. It wasn't long before she was picking up modeling jobs and winning beauty pageants. Betty's life was looking up again. Her sister Goldie had moved to San Francisco to live with her, and then she fell in love with another serviceman who was in town on leave. Her new boyfriend, Joe, didn't know she was married, though. That was just a technicality she was going to take care of as soon as Billy returned from the Pacific. Betty allowed herself to feel hope again. But then Billy came home to her, and her boyfriend Joe soon followed. Betty told Joe she was breaking up with him because she met a new serviceman and married him. The new serviceman she was referring to was her controlling, already husband, Billy. Betty couldn't tell him she wanted a divorce. He returned to her weighing only 117 pounds. He had almost died of dysentery, wasting away in a military hospital to a striking 84 pounds. She felt an obligation to help him get healthy and back on his feet. But Billy found out Betty had been using her maiden name while he was out at sea, and he accused her of having affairs. A month later, Betty was pregnant. Billy was enraged. He refused to believe that the baby could be his, so he stormed off back to Nashville. But he couldn't leave Bettie behind that easily. He convinced her to move back to Nashville, and because of the pregnancy, she did. She had received an offer from Warner Brothers to do a screen test right before she left. But she chose her unborn child over her own career aspirations. She needed to give her marriage a shot for her baby. She gave up a chance to be a Hollywood star for her child. Sadly, Bettie suffered a miscarriage soon after her arrival back in Nashville. She finally left him in the fall of 1946 when she was 23 years old. Instead of returning to California, Bettie moved to Miami. She didn't know what she wanted anymore, but a fresh start somewhere new wouldn't hurt. She landed a secretarial job with a furniture importer and would be working with him in Haiti. This turned out to be a very rich experience for her, and she dove deep into the culture and formed many wonderful friendships with the local Haitians. She was loving her new life in Haiti, but then her married boss attempted to rape her. And then a violent civil unrest against Americans in Haiti. Bettie and several other Americans had to flee the island in the middle of the night. After Haiti, Bettie bounced around for a couple of years. Miami, New York, Nashville, back to New York, back to Florida, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and back to New York again. And she had a few more tries with Billy. Something kept drawing her back to him, and she regretted it every time. Third time's a charm for Bettie Page and her life in New York City. She was accepted into a summer theater apprentice program and worked on several plays. She mostly worked behind the scenes, but she did some small acting parts as well. And it was at this time when she met an amateur photographer who gave her her trademark feature, her bangs. Bettie dove deeper into modeling and soon climbed the ranks in the modeling world, not with super famous photographers, but she was getting there. She was willing to pose nude, so that made her stand apart from most other models at the time. She and a few photographers were even almost charged with creating pornography for being caught posing nude in a park. Outdoors was Bettie's favorite place to pose. Bettie never saw nudity or sexual expression as the taboos that they were viewed at in those days, and I guess still are today. She was very free with her body in terms of artistic expression. By the early 1950s, Bettie was a highly sought-after model and was making good money doing so. So good, it became her only job. She was soon gracing the covers of many magazines, and then she was on the cover of everything else from matchbooks to romance novels to playing cards. She was a star cover girl. More of a trashy magazine cover girl, but in a good way. Her look and allure made her stand out from the crowd, and everyone was looking. There was a dark underworld in this time with a strong desire for bondage and fetish photos and films, a huge taboo in the 1950s. And Bettie was the perfect model and performer for these. She was a regular model and the most popular one for the distributor of these mail-order bondage and fetish photos and reels, Irving Klaw. There wasn't much Bettie wouldn't do in front of a camera. The money was great and the work was easy, and she never had to be nude or perform sexual acts in Irving Klaw's work. All of the shots taken were done so in a creative way that would leave the consumer open to use their imagination. If only these consumers in the BDSM and fetish underworld knew that one day anything they could ever dream of looking at would be free and accessible in their own homes. Bettie later said of her work with Irving Klaw, quote, "They keep referring to me in the magazines and newspapers and everywhere else as the Queen of Bondage. The only bondage posing I ever did was for Irving Klaw and his sister Paula. Usually every other Saturday, he had a session for 4 or 5 hours with 4 or 5 models and a couple of extra photographers, and in order to get paid, you had to do an hour of bondage. And that was the only reason I did it. I never had any inkling along that line. I don't really disapprove of it. I think you can do your own thing as long as you're not hurting anybody else. That's been my philosophy ever since I was a little girl. I never looked down my nose at it. In fact, we used to laugh at some of the requests that came through the mail, even from judges and lawyers and doctors and people in high positions. Even back in the 50s, they went in for the whips and the ties and everything else, end quote. Now, there were supposedly some more graphic sexual photos that were taken by amateur photographers, but the professional work she did was always clean. Bettie was busy, and she was famous in the niche pinup and fetish genre, but she still wanted to be an actress. Her notoriety helped her get into some off-Broadway stage productions and some television spots, including an appearance on the Jackie Gleason Show. Then Bettie finally made it into the movies in 1953 when she was 30 years old. Not the glamorous Hollywood movies of her dreams, though. She starred in a series of burlesque films, but she was happy with this work. Any other opportunities that she was presented with in movies, including with Howard Hughes' RKO Studio, she was expected to sleep her way into roles. And she wasn't willing to do that. By 1955, Bettie Page was awarded the title Miss Pinup Girl of the World, and she was Playboy's January 1955 Playmate of the Month, with her photo wearing nothing but a Santa hat gracing the centerfold. She had gained a public bad girl reputation because of the work she chose, but Bettie was still the highly intelligent, down-to-earth, outgoing girl that she'd always been. A girl who didn't smoke, didn't drink, and didn't do drugs. Meanwhile, Senator Estes Kefauver was aiming for the presidency, and he enlisted the help of the FBI to take down indecency like the bondage and fetish material that Irving Klaw was producing, the material that Bettie Page was the star of. Kefauver tried to have it deemed as pornography, even though there was zero nudity and zero sexual acts being performed. Klaw was indicted and exonerated, with the terms that he would destroy all existing negatives and reels of his work, which he did. Only a few would remain hidden away. This would mark the end of his mail-order photography and film reel business, and signal the end of Bettie Page's modeling career. Bettie later recounted, quote, "I quit modeling in December 1957 when I left New York for good. I was tired of my life as it was, and I wanted to try something else," end quote. After her departure from the modeling world as the most famous pinup model in the world, Bettie retreated to her happy place, Miami. A few months after she got back to Florida, she injured her back while playing volleyball, and she was wheelchair-bound for 4 months while she recovered. She really didn't have the fortune you might think from her success in modeling. What savings she had when she walked away was now gone less than a year later as she recovered and was unable to fall back on her usual secretarial work. She couldn't afford to pay the rent on her storage shed, and all of her belongings were sold, including her entire modeling portfolio. But remember, Bettie has a teaching degree. She decided it was time to utilize her education and bright mind and find a job in teaching. But it turned out Bettie really didn't have what it took to be a teacher, and she resigned 3 months into her position as a 5th grade teacher. She later recalled, quote, "I was very disappointed in my teaching experience and didn't care to pursue it any further," end quote. It's not for everyone. As it turned out, she was assigned to the most notoriously rowdy class of children, a class only a seasoned teacher would be able to keep focused and under control. So she didn't stand a chance. She probably could have been a wonderful teacher if she had been allowed to follow her own path in life and had never gotten off track in her marriage to Toxic Billy. As for Bettie's love life, she never did find any kind of true love. She had several flings, some with married men, but nothing usually lasted longer than a few months. One on-again, off-again fling was with a man several years younger than her named Armand Walterson. Armand proposed, and Bettie said yes. Bettie Page married her second husband, Armand Walterson, on November 26, 1958. Unfortunately, I can't tell you this was Bettie's happily ever after either. All of that abuse and trauma from Bettie's childhood and early adult life had taken a huge toll on her mental health. Her behavior had become erratic and unpredictable. Her moods were all over the place, and she would go through periods of deep depression. She simply wasn't an easy person to be in a relationship with. Now, as some of you know, I'm a preschool teacher and I'm trained in brain development. So I can tell you that the extreme trauma that Betty experienced in her childhood, particularly by her father, had severe effects on her mental health. That kind of trauma disrupts healthy development of the brain and literally rewires the neural connections that create our perception of the world and how we react to it. So when the brain is developing, traumatic events can restructure the brain chemistry to later affect the way a person regulates emotions, maintains relationships, manages stress and anxiety, and perceives the world around them. There is a direct correlation between childhood trauma and depression, anxiety, substance abuse, relationship issues, self-harm, and personality disorders. It's a big deal. So Bettie Page was set up for failure in life. Today, she would probably have the support she would need. But the 1950s were not a supportive place for someone needing mental health therapy. That being said, Betty's marriage to Armand was not a happy one. It sounds like Armand was a really nice man, but he was young. He was 23 to Betty's 35, and just not equipped to emotionally support a partner with mental illness such as Betty's. Just a month and a half after they got married, Betty and Armand separated after a heated argument. The argument led Betty to the beach, which was where she found the most peace. And as she sobbed, she said she felt a hand lead her into a church across the street. The New Year's service was in progress, and Betty became enraptured. And at this moment, on January 1st, 1959, Betty turned her life over to God. She spent the next few years bouncing around the country, attending Bible schools, and even joined famous evangelist Billy Graham's crusade for a summer. She continually worked secretarial jobs to make ends meet, just as she had done before her short modeling career. The money afforded her enrollment in more Bible study courses in the various cities that she was jumping between. The girl was a real vagabond. She never had a true home. Now she had dreams of becoming a foreign missionary. She wanted to help others, but no mission board would accept her since she had been through divorce. When Betty was 40 years old, she returned to Nashville. Her father was dying and she wanted to be closer to her family. She taught Sunday school in a poor neighborhood in Nashville, and she would bring her students on little outings that would bring them and Betty herself a lot of peace and joy. She visited her father every single night. The man who had caused her so much pain, and she extended nothing but grace to him in his final days. It was bittersweet because Roy himself had changed his life and chose religion. He was actually a preacher by this point. Even so, Roy denied the sexual abuse against his daughter until his dying breath, so Betty was never able to come to peace with it. Roy Page died in January of 1964 at the age of 68. Betty wanted nothing more than to become a foreign missionary, so she had an idea. She needed to marry Billy again. Although she was still technically married to Armand, many Bible mentors had told her that if she could be married to the first man she married in the eyes of God, then they together could be accepted as missionaries. Yikes. So she secured that divorce from Armand finally, and she and Billy got married for a second time at the exact same courthouse that they were married at 20 years earlier. But Betty's plan backfired. Their relationship was as fiery as ever, and the marriage was quickly annulled. Billy later said, quote, "She had a split personality, I think. She could be loving one day, and the next day, it wouldn't be me that was making her mad. It would be something else a lot of times. When she was mad at everybody," end quote. Oh, the poor girl needed help so badly. After this failed reunion with Billy, Betty returned to her place of peace, Florida. And here she met her next husband, a man named Harry Lear. He said of their courtship, quote, "Even the dogs would turn their heads when she went by in a bikini, and she was in her 40s then," end quote. Betty and Harry were married on Valentine's Day, 1967, and Betty became the stepmother to an 11-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 7-year-old. Betty the vagabond, the girl who never had a true home or a true family, had finally found stability and happiness. But her mental health struggles would eventually take a toll on this newfound happiness, and Betty and Harry were divorced in January of 1972 after 5 years. Betty then put all of her energy towards God. Those 5 years gave Betty the safest and most anchored moments of her life, though, but things deteriorated fast from there. After the divorce, Betty retreated to Boca Raton and stayed at a motel on the grounds of the Bibletown Community Church. Shortly after her arrival there, she caused a terrifying commotion when she began running through the motel, shouting at the top of her lungs about the retribution of God while waving a .22 caliber pistol in the air. She was arrested, and the police released her into her now ex-husband Harry's custody. A couple of months into her stay with Harry and his children, Betty called them all into the living room. She forced the family to stand in front of a picture of Jesus that was hanging on the wall, and with a knife in her hand, she ordered them to pray. The family survived the terrifying ordeal, and Betty was admitted into a psychiatric facility. Upon her release, Harry allowed her to live in his home for another 7 years. He wanted to be a safe place for her. What an admirable man. I'm not going to get into all of the details of Betty's struggles with mental illness that are out there, but I will include that she was eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. I don't think she ever received adequate treatment for her mental illness, and I just don't think it's fair to her memory to get into too many details about the incidents fueled by her mental illness. I'll just include that she did have a few other violent offenses over the years, including a 1979 stabbing that landed her briefly in prison before being transferred to another mental health facility. Another stabbing, actually a slashing this time, in 1982, brought 60-year-old Bettie Page to trial for attempted murder. Betty was ruled insane and was committed to the Patton State Psychiatric Hospital for 10 years. She was 70 years old when she was released. During her time of incarceration, the world was experiencing a resurgence in her work as a pinup model. Her popularity was on the rise again, and she became an idol to a new generation. A true cult icon. But in reality, the modern-day Bettie Page was mentally ill and penniless. She tried to receive royalties for the use of her images, but that didn't bring much success to her. Bettie Page was a culture icon and inspiration to thousands for decades, and she likely always will be. She inspired the looks of Madonna, Katy Perry, and Rihanna. She was the inspiration for Uma Thurman's look in Pulp Fiction. She was right all those years earlier. It was her physical appearance that would help her to amount to anything. But what she really needed all her life was love and security. Not many people know that that's all their cultural icon really needed from the world. But for the most part, Betty was all alone in this life. Betty lived out her final years very privately. I hope she found the peace that she so desperately craved. In 2008, Betty was hospitalized after a heart attack and subsequently developed pneumonia. Her body and soul had finally taken all it could handle. Bettie Page, the cultural icon who took the world by storm for a few short years in the 1950s, died at the age of 85 years old on December 11, 2008. The pinup known for her racy images and bondage shots left this world completely devoted to her God. Luckily, help for mental illness is much more accessible today. If you need help, please talk to someone. Seek help. If you find yourself in a mental health crisis, know that you can call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233, and the National Sexual Assault Hotline is 1-800-656-4673. I only have a few more interesting facts to share about Betty because I think I shared pretty much everything Betty was comfortable with sharing already. Bullet point number 1. Betty's youngest brother Jack was a Golden Gloves boxer. Bullet point number 2. Betty made almost all of the costumes and bikinis that she wore in her modeling shoots herself. She also made her wedding gown for her second wedding, which was the only official wedding she had. The others were courthouse weddings. Bullet point number 3. After Betty's 1955 Playboy centerfold, Hugh Hefner remained a huge fan of hers. In conclusion, Bettie Page was set up for hardship in life, and she would have to work extremely hard to make it out of the difficult circumstances of her early life. And she did work extremely hard. She was an outstanding student, she was highly intelligent, and she had dreams and a strong drive to achieve those dreams. But then she met a man who would prove to be the toxic glue that would hold her back from ever fully achieving her dreams. Bettie Page could have been the rich and glamorous movie star that she always dreamed of, but Billy held her back. She could have been an amazing teacher and enriched the lives of hundreds of children, but Billy held her back. Billy and her father, at the hands of his years of sexual abuse, took away her dreams, her self-love, and her self-esteem. Bettie Page was left to believe only her beauty was worth anything to the world. Bettie Page had a remarkable mind and a remarkable soul. Whether it was her studies, her relationships, her modeling, or her devotion to religion, she always set forth with a loving heart and good intentions. Her trauma and untreated mental illness held her back from the great things she could have given the world. We will never know what could have been. Thank you, Bettie Page, for enduring what you had to endure and still giving yourself to the world as you did. You sacrificed your dreams for others, and in return, you gave the world an icon through your beauty. I hope in sharing your story, a few more people can understand just what you went through. So every time we see your iconic photos, we can also see the pain and suffering that you endured during your tragic life. Because your life was important. Thank you for your sacrifices, and thank you for being our icon. And thank you all for listening. You can really help the show by leaving a 5-star rating where you listen to your podcasts, and if you're able to, a positive review on Apple Podcasts. Give the show a follow on Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok as well. Love you guys. My main source of research for this episode was a book titled The Real Bettie Page: The Truth About the Queen of Pinups by Richard Foster. I also used BettiePage.com, Wikipedia.com, and IMDB.